thank you for inviting me here today and giving me the opportunity to tell you a little more about who PHI is and what we do. I know I see a lot of familiar faces out there, so some of you may already be pretty familiar with what we do, but for others, I thought I might just kind of give you some background into how PHI started. All right, well, like I said, I want to start by giving you a little bit of history, and I'll try to make this fairly brief. So Post-Polio Health International traces its roots really all the way back to 1949 when our founder, his name was Virginia Grace Laurie, also known as Jenny the most, began volunteering at Toomey Pavilion, which at the time was the contagious disease ward at City Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. And it later became a major respiratory center for polio patients. Jenny herself was not a polio survivor, but her family was profoundly impacted by polio. The year before she was born, 4 of her siblings contracted polio, and her sisters, Virginia and Grace, after who she was named, passed away. Another sister survived, but was left with a disability.
Sorry, Brian, unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
Right? Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
okay.
You're good.
All right. So I was saying, our founder, Jenny, did you get the part where she was a volunteer at Toomey Pavilion, which was a major polio respiratory center in Cleveland? So again, she had 4 siblings that contracted polio, 2 of which died, and a younger brother was left with a pretty severe disability. And then he later passed away from pneumonia and respiratory complications at age 16. So it really left sort of a deep mark on her, and her family was pretty profoundly affected by polio. And she, of course, was named after her 2 older sisters that passed away, and she'd sometimes refer to herself as a replacement child for them. And so because of this family history, it's really only natural for her to maybe become a volunteer. So she became a Red Cross volunteer at Toomey Pavilion, which I mentioned was only really one of 15 respiratory centers for polio patients in the 1950s across the country. And so these centers were individuals with severe polio that were in need of, at the time, like rocking beds, if you're familiar with those, or iron lungs. They provided excellent rehabilitation care, but until 1953, most of these permanent respiratory users that were in iron lungs sort of seemed destined to remain either at these centers or probably in some sort of institution for the rest of their lives. But in 1953, in order to save money by avoiding this lifelong hospitalization that at the time cost a high rate of $37 a day, they would say, Rancho Los Amigos out in Downey, California, pioneered a system of home care that could reduce those costs to about $10 a day. And so they started sending home polio survivors from these centers and their iron lungs, their chest cuirasses. And so Toomey Pavilion, where she worked, sort of started emptying out. And of course, the polio vaccine came into existence in 1955, and the number of new polio patients declined dramatically throughout the decade as well. But she continued to work at Toomey Pavilion throughout the 1950s and was trying to figure out ways to keep in touch with her old polio pals that had come to the center and then gone home. And she said at the time, she said, quote, "It became apparent that these patients had 2 vital needs, right? People and information. So they wanted to keep up with each other, and they also wanted to share information about their lives and equipment." Let me advance the slide. So she, along with her husband, Joe, you can see pictured on the left there, started to meet those needs by building a heated pool with a lift at their home and holding annual reunions of these alumni of the Respiratory Center. And at the time she was there, they had sort of started, you can see on the left, started the informal sort of newsletter that they passed around to the patients at the Respiratory Center. And in 1958, they formalized it a little bit more, made it a little bit more professional, as you can see on the right, and published what they called the Toomeyville Junior Gazette, which they shortened to Toomey J Gazette a couple of years later, and would eventually become PHI's major publication for the next few decades, called the Rehabilitation Gazette. And it mainly featured news of how polio survivors were managing at their homes. Later, there included a lot of information about attending schools, attending colleges, finding jobs, raising families, and topics like that that were relevant to polio survivors as they aged in the 60s and 70s. So by 1959, going back a little bit, the vaccine had, like we said, had largely ended most large polio outbreaks, and you saw the public stopped giving as much money to the March of Dimes, so they weren't taking in as much money, and so the March of Dimes stopped paying for attendance and largely closed most of these respiratory centers. And this sudden loss of attendant payments caused some panic among the polio survivor population. Of course, back then there was no Social Security, disability, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no vocational rehab. So most of these people relied on welfare or help from churches or family. But fortunately, polio survivors had gone home from the centers. Most of them had gone home a few years earlier and had already arranged some sort of attendant care, and they had some time to work out systems of community support. However, they also sort of craved that psychological support and camaraderie with other survivors, and that's where PHI's publications sort of filled that need. In 1959, Jenny led a letter writing campaign alerting survivors in every state and asking them to write to their congressman, urging a national attendant care legislation. And while the national campaign was unsuccessful, it did call Washington's attention to the problems of people with severe disability. Although it didn't succeed on the national level, it was successful in California, largely due to the efforts of respiratory polio survivors. And so their state legislation established attendant care that sort of later cleared the path to the independent living movement. According to Jenny, she always called attendant care the linchpin of independence. And so this 1959 campaign for national attendant care sort of demonstrated and solidified her belief in networking, or the power of connecting people with people and the power of information. So she continued publishing the Rehabilitation Gazette all the way up into her death in 1989. And several years before that, she also created PHI's two current newsletters. At the time it was called Polio Network News, and now we call it Post-Polio Health. We started publishing that in 1985, and a couple of years later started publishing Ivan News, which is now called Ventilator Assisted Living, for those home ventilator users. And it was through these connections that Jenny had forged, and through the Gazette, that she first started to bring attention to what we now call the late effects of polio, or post-polio syndrome. And so sort of a catalyzing event was this 1979 letter she got from a gentleman, Larry Schneider, who was complaining that he was becoming tired more easily, had less energy, and experiencing other new problems, which he hypothesized was probably due to his having had polio when he was younger. And this sort of prompted Jenny to bring together polio survivors, physicians who treated them, and advocates in a hotel in Chicago in 1981 at what would become PHI's first international conference, called Whatever Happened to the Polio Patient. In the intervening years, we've held 10 additional conferences, the most recent being in 2014 in St. Louis. We typically would hold them every, in the 80s, they're held every 2 years, and then after that, about every 3 to 6 years. So that's a little bit of the history of where we come from, and it's maybe a little bit more than you needed to hear, but it sort of gets to the core of what PHI excels in, which is education and networking. So how are we fulfilling that legacy today? Let me sort of walk through some of our programs real quick. So in terms of education, we continue to publish the 2 newsletters I mentioned earlier. Post-Polio Health is a quarterly newsletter. We send it out in print, and it's also available online, and it contains a mix of both medical and practical information for polio survivors. Ventilator assisted living is put out bi-monthly, online only. It addresses the needs of home ventilator users, some of which had polio, but it also addresses other neuromuscular disorders as well. So having been around for, over 60 years, we have a huge library of articles, of videos we've recorded, publications on just about every topic related to living with polio, all of which is accessible on either of our 3 websites. You can see there's postpolio.org is our primary website, but we also, about 10 years ago, started a secondary website called Polio Place, which is meant to sort of serve as a repository for all this information we collected related to polio. So it has a large section on practical advice on living with polio. One section is just a listing of all previously published medical articles related to polio. And so another section might deal with, people who were prominent, biographies of people who were prominent in developing the vaccine and in the independent living movement. So between the 2 websites, pretty much everything we've ever published is available. So a lot of what we do is just to, fielding questions by email, fielding questions from people calling in on the phone, and a lot of it's just directing people to relevant information that they're looking for. So it exists out there, and we're sort of filling that role of connector. And our networking legacy continues through connecting people with post-polio experts and physicians, and also with local support groups in their area. We've, for many years, have published a resource directory with this information, not just for polio survivors, but for our ventilator users as well. And when we redesigned our PHI website 2 years ago, we took this, what was a print directory, and made it an interactive feature utilizing Google Maps. So now you can go into the website, go to the resource locator, and you can either just hit your location button or type in where you are, and it'll bring up a listing of physicians, local support groups, funding resources in your area. And we continually update these. And as more and more polio specialists have begun to retire in recent years, We've also made a concerted effort to find younger physicians interested in treating the needs of our aging polio population. So, we've seen, like I said, a lot of the physicians who've treated polio survivors have also been aging, and some of them have retired. And another similar trend we've seen in recent years is the shutting down of some local and even statewide polio support groups. And this is due to a variety of factors. I mean, the polio population is shrinking in this country, in the United States. So when I started in PHI in 2008, we used to estimate that there were about 750,000 polio survivors in this country. Today, our best estimates place us at probably about half of that number, or somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000. And of course, another issue with support groups is that polio survivors, of course, are aging, and they're less mobile and less able to travel to meetings. And so you also see fewer and fewer people willing to step up into leadership positions with these groups too. So a lot of groups have either shut down because they don't have great attendance, or simply because they couldn't find anyone to take over running these groups. Of course, the pandemic has only made that more difficult. The groups that have been, I think, unwilling or unable to adapt have really struggled in the last couple of years. But many groups have been able to adapt, and they've utilized, Zoom or social media. And in many cases, it's allowed them to reach people that they normally wouldn't be able to reach, or they haven't been able to reach in the past, that haven't been able to travel to in-person meetings, either because transportation is an issue for them, or maybe they don't live, they live an hour or two away from the city where these meetings are hosted. So Zoom has been, I think, a really great new tool for people, and the pandemic has sort of forced groups that were reluctant to use it before to have to adopt it and change. And so for some groups, I think that's been really good. Of course, there's limitations to Zoom, of course. I think probably a lot of us sitting here today have probably had our share of Zoom calls over the past 2 years, where maybe, you sort of checked out halfway through mentally because you've been on them all day, or you've been on them all week, and it's sort of zoomed out. But I think a lot of groups have, from talking with them, have settled on sort of a hybrid approach, holding in-person meetings when pandemic conditions have allowed, or when the weather's nice and they can read outside, and then switching over to the Zoom meetings when conditions aren't really amenable to meeting in person. Of course, these same tools can also help us reach survivors in parts of the world that were largely inaccessible in the past too. But even that's not easy, even with Zoom and with the use of social media, and as developing countries become more connected with better internet speeds, there's still sometimes significant language and cultural barriers that have to be overcome. And the other issue is that, especially in the developing world, their polio populations sometimes have different needs than those of us in North America or Europe or Australia, partly because they tend to, on the whole, be younger. And so they might not have as many problems related with aging, but may be more interested in issues like raising a family, or finding a job, holding a job, and issues like that. So even when we do effectively reach these individuals, we're sometimes at a loss to direct them to local resources on the ground, be it medical or or financial that may be able to impact their lives. So there's still that significant hurdle and a great need for establishing partnerships and relationships with local entities. So significant challenges still remain when it comes to serving this population, and it would really take a concerted effort to overcome those, I think. So I'll just kind of wrap up there, and hopefully I helped you understand a little bit better today about what PHI does, and more importantly, why we do it. All right, and I'll turn it back over to Ken.
Okay, thank you, Brian. A couple, I'm sure people have questions for you. I'm going to start out with a question or a couple of questions.
Yep.
So is the bulk of the members or the users of your service from North America?
Yeah, we have members from all over, both in Europe and in the developing world, but I would say the vast majority reside in the United States and Canada. Yes.
Okay. The only reason I asked because the statistic you mentioned was from America, I guess, as far as and of course in America or any country that's been eradicated many years ago, the numbers are going down because people are dying, unfortunately. But
yeah, I find that the worldwide numbers tend to be a little less reliable. I sometimes see the figure 11 to 15 million polio survivors worldwide quoted, but I'm not sure, exactly how accurate that is.
Okay, and my second question is post-polio syndrome. How much attention is your organization give to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's, like I said, for the PHI, that's our main focus. We also have another side of our organization, International Ventilator Users Network, which focuses on the needs of polio survivors who use home mechanical ventilation, but also addresses people with other neuromuscular disorders that require home ventilation. But our primary focus, yes, is post-polio syndrome.
Okay, good, excellent. Yeah. And we have two people with questions. Joyce, we'll start with Joyce.
Thank you, Ken. So thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I have a question about some of the other countries that have been heavily affected by polio, and they're even not entirely, but majority English speaking. Nigeria, India, places like that. Is it that, well, they certainly have had a lot of polio, so they must be having some post-polio syndrome. Life expectancies in those countries may not be what they are in Canada and the US, but what, if anything, is going on in countries like that to address the needs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, like I said, you sort of have to look at every country differently because every country's got a different availability of local resources, different health systems, and different levels of medical care that were available to people in the immediate aftermath of polio. So in some countries, their needs are very, very basic. It may be even rehabilitative surgery. It may be just, finding a place to live or some sort of livelihood. And then in other countries, populations are a little bit older and they're sort of past that stage and they have somewhat better developed networks. And so we try to tap into those as much as we can. But like I said, sometimes people come to us, especially, in terms of people contacting us from overseas. It's outside of the developed world, it's probably most common. We get calls from, or emails and calls from India, Pakistan, the Philippines, even like you said, Nigeria occasionally. And sometimes just don't have those resources on the ground to direct them to. Some of the major cities we know of post-polio specialists we can refer them to. Some of these places do have local organizations we can point them to, and sometimes those just don't exist. And so we try to provide them with as much information as we can to help them become advocates for themselves.
So are there satellite groups in other countries? And the other question I wanted to ask you is, I understand that there's a case of paralytic polio now in New York State. So an unvaccinated child. So what are we doing about acceptance of vaccinations in US and Canada, and that might result in a resurgence of polio?
Yeah, good question. So getting back to the first part, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. What was the first part of your question?
The first part of the question was, do you have any satellite groups?
Oh, satellites, yes, sorry. No, we don't have any satellite offices in other countries. We try to partner. A lot of countries have their own developed post-polio groups, but be it national groups or local groups. And we try to partner and network with those groups whenever we can and direct people in those countries to those groups, because they really know best about what resources are available locally and how to navigate maybe their social welfare and medical systems best. Getting back to the case in New York, I'm sure most of you have seen there was a case of polio reported in Rockland County, which is just north of New York City, last week. This is a case of what they call circulating vaccine-derived polio. So likely someone got the oral polio virus in another country, probably traveled here, was shedding virus, it may pass undetected between unvaccinated people or mutated, reacquired virulence, and then infected an unvaccinated, I think, young man in New York. So I know, from what I understand, that Rockland County has started trying to vaccinate people for polio in that area. I know they're running a vaccine clinic right now. And so they had vaccinated, I think, 300 or 400 people recently. For people that already, have their polio vaccines, it's not much of a concern. I think there's very little to no risk of it spreading, but in areas like that where the population is under-vaccinated, there probably is a little bit of risk, and so we're trying to address that by stepping up vaccination efforts.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And before I go to the next question, anybody who's in this group who is not on our mailing list and would like to be on our mailing list, please put your contact information in the chat. Our next question is from John.
Comment and question. Brian, before Joan retired, she took part in a paper with Antonio Toniolo, Mary Ann from Australia, and myself, which actually indicated some worldwide figures somewhat higher than the one you quoted. Are you aware of that paper?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Of course.
Right. Okay. That's number one. Number two. The problem that I can see with you have, and we've got in Europe as well, is that we don't have the network, and there are hidden things going on. To actually answer one of the questions, Nigeria, there are polio hospitals being run by Plan International, which is in fact a children's charity. So they're working through that. In India, you've got the Cheshire Foundation, and they're also doing stuff in Kenya and everything else. We don't have somehow or other, if you can come up with the idea, of reinventing the wheel, how we can do it, we've got to bring all those together and to get them to find out where they are and who they are. And there needs to be a central repository for it. There are so few organizations inside of the globe which have actually got paid staff or have got office facilities. There's only 3 in Europe, Ireland, UK, and Denmark, because the Finnish operation is gone. So we've got those. How do we bring it together? How do we actually do it? And where can we provide a central hub?
Yeah, I mean, partly that's what our directory tries to address by at least listing all these available resources. But as far as, are you talking about greater cooperation between these entities?
It's not just greater cooperation, it's actually finding out who the people are, because
Yeah.
for example, a lot of people don't realize that Cheshire Foundation in Malawi has got a polio hospital.
Yeah.
Treats polio patients, and and it's actually trying to find how you get these and where do you get the information from to bring it together. The PHI directory is brilliant because it brings a lot of them together. The trouble is, like yourself, I and others, like the European Polio Union, don't have all the bits coming into it all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's sort of the challenge. Is a lot of the resources that come our way is sort of self-reported or reported by other polio survivors or by other physicians that come across these resources, some who work internationally, and so we don't always have a complete listing like that, and it's sort of always been a challenge for us to make sure it's as comprehensive as it can be.
Thank you, Brian. And one of the visions of this group, and we're a Rotary-based group, is to kind of, in John's case, the Europe Polio Union is like an umbrella organization. If we could kind of do the same thing with this organization, and at least have connecting, maybe sometime in the future, bring all these groups together and have some sort of a seminar on that. But that's a vision. Chris, you have a question?
So just, the case in Rockland County is a wake-up call for, not only North America, but also for other countries. The DNA sample shows that it came from Europe somehow. And that Rockland County a couple of years ago had an outbreak in measles, because I think that vaccine resistance is something that is happening all over North America. And so I think that one of the things that we need to be aware of is that we need to make families aware of polio again, because I think they're not really have it on their radar. And the other question I had is about post-polio syndrome. Do we have a brochure that we can access so that some of the symptoms that the doctor from India was saying that, they're not diagnosing, they've said they've only had a couple of cases, so that we can share that with physicians. I was at an eye doctor's appointment for my mom yesterday, and someone who is starting a physician's assistance program at a local college in Worcester, Massachusetts, was telling me that one of their rotations is about polio. And so that's something that I think if we're going to do advocacy with this group, if we can connect with some of these physicians assistance programs, they just asked me to be a speaker when they start the program on polio, because they do have a whole section on polio that they do. I think when you were talking about physicians that are retiring, this is a great group that we need to start to access and to make them aware of post-polio syndrome, and also circulating vaccine and how that impacts when they're doing their diagnosis as a physician's assistant. Just a comment.
Yeah, no, those are some great points. We've always sort of struggled with how do we educate new physicians, either in med school or just starting out, about polio, especially since they'd likely never experienced a polio case, an acute polio case, obviously, and may have had little interaction with polio survivors. We've getting it into these med school curriculums can be sort of daunting, just because, like I said, the population as a whole isn't very large compared to other diseases, so it doesn't get as much attention in the med school curriculum. But there are individual med schools that have been open to it and invited polio survivors to speak. Most recently, PHI has been cooperating with Oakland University's medical school in Michigan. We send speakers there to educate their young med school students on post-polio syndrome. But most of the time, education takes the form of a physician might have a new polio patient or maybe multiple polio patients, and they want to just be better educated on the subject. And so they come to PHI, and we can steer them towards resources and educate them that way. Granted, that's not great for educating a large number of doctors, but it's sort of what we've been the route we've been forced to take. Yeah.
So, Brian, are you aware of a pamphlet or something on post-polio syndrome?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, we have a brochure. We have one brochure. It's more about our organization, but we also have a 3-part brochure that sort of breaks down the basics of post-polio syndrome. One part is addressed towards survivors, another towards health professionals, and the third part addresses family members or caregivers.
Okay, if you could somehow send me something on that, it would be good as advocates that we have that to give out.
Sure, certainly. Yeah.
Grace has a question.
Okay, I unmuted. Hooray. I have a comment and a question. And my comment is, I just want to thank you so much. I always enroll and subscribe to your newsletter. And last year I just had financial issues. And you all gave me a free subscription for a year. And I was able to afford it this year. And I just wanted to thank you, because it meant so much to me. And then my question is I did receive, and I paid for all those packets of information to hand out to my doctors and to my family. The quandary is they won't read them. I have given them to everyone, and they look at me and they just toss it aside. So I pick it up out of the garbage can and take it back home. And I don't know whether it's because it's so much information, but even just the small little one like the Mio Farrow, they question it. They just don't believe it. And so I'm just wondering, is there any way that they can contact the Post-Polio International? I just don't know.
Yeah, you're more than welcome to refer them to us. We have physicians on our board that are willing to speak with other physicians. We have a medical advisory committee that consists of about a dozen post-polio experts, all of who are willing to take the time to educate other physicians if need be. But like you said, I don't think your experience is too out of the ordinary as far as bringing information to your doctor. Some doctors are willing to sit down and read through that and take a look at that information. And we found that other physicians, for whatever reason, maybe they're a little closed-minded, maybe it's just they don't feel they have the time to do that, and they're not as open to looking through outside information.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Grace. And it would be good to get to the essence of why doctors are not giving it the proper attention, but that's a whole nother discussion for another meeting. Linda, you have a question or a hand up?
Yes. Yeah. Hi. Thank you for a great presentation. So I'm not impacted directly, but kind of directly. My aunt who raised me has polio. She got it when she was 5. And a year later, the vaccine came in. So just bad luck, I guess.
Yeah.
But I'm Canadian. I'm in Australia at the moment. I live in Australia, but I'm Lebanese also. So I grew up in Lebanon, and in Lebanon, for people with disabilities in general, it's hard to find a job, or like it's just nowadays, even for everybody, it's just difficult. But back then and during the war, of course, they suffered quite a bit. But there is a group called Arc-en-Ciel, which translates into rainbow, basically. And it was initially a Spanish mission. And what they do, I don't believe that there's anything that specifically specializes in polio, and different specialists, doctors will address different issues that a patient feels post-polio or deals with post-polio, different surgeries and so on. But that institution deals with disabilities, physical disabilities in general. And what they do is they kind of create they've created, they became kind of like, they have different ateliers, they call them, but different workshops for training individuals, and making ceramics for hotels and things like that. So my question is, so this is a comment, but my question is basically, would we benefit from having let's say a list that we can populate with these different organizations that patients could be referred to, like, or that polio survivors could be referred to, so that they could, access different opportunities if they're available, like jobs, employment, training, medical referrals, and so on?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I mean, I think, like you said, we found in a lot of developing countries, they might not have dedicated post-polio support organizations. And so we often try to refer them to disability advocacy organizations, because, all disabilities are different, but there's a lot of needs they have in common. And often these disability organizations are fairly effective at addressing those, even if they might not have specific medical information about the late effects of polio, which is a gap that PHI can help to fill if there's not a language barrier there. So that's an excellent point. There are, in a lot of countries, wider disability organizations that can effectively help polio survivors. And we try to include those in our directory if we've had some contact with them and are familiar with them and what they do, and know that they try to help or have helped polio survivors that we've been in contact with.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Brian, is your information available in multiple languages?
A lot of our basic information about the late effects of polio has been translated into a number of languages, and that's available on the website in certain places. We have a lot of Spanish language resources, translation that have been done. But there's also, we have stuff in French, German, Japanese, Farsi, Mandarin, at least the basics. On Polio Place, there's a Google Translate tool where you can translate into any language. But obviously those translations are probably imperfect. especially when you're dealing with medical terminology or complex information. Maybe I'm not sure, exactly what the quality of those translations are, but at least it exists and might give someone a rudimentary translation and help them understand some basics about post-polio. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Brian. Barbara, you have your hand up.
Unmute yourself, Barbara.
Yeah, gotta get you off mute. There you go.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my mouse this morning.
Okay.
I have thought that the biggest issue is public relations and marketing. And in the United States, we have organizations for multiple sclerosis and muscular dystrophy. They have lots of staff, they have lots of money. But polio survivors, at least in the United States, we don't have that type of organization. It's always been, PHI has done a wonderful job throughout the year. I thought for years, like we have Dr. Maynard in the United States is a wonderful speaker. If he could go on our Kelly Clarkson TV show, years ago, Oprah Winfrey would have been perfect. Ellen DeGeneres isn't doing it, but if we could just, I think, that would be a way to get the word out, because a lot of people, everybody seems to know kind of what polio is. They've heard that word, but I mean, I talked to 1 in 200 people, even doctors, and they have no idea about what post-polio syndrome is. No idea at all. And just, someone to go on. And when the pandemic came around, I thought, they could try to get on a show to compare it to the COVID pandemic, to the polio pandemic, but some way, I'm not sure how to do that, but I think, that would be important, at least to get it out to the whole public, which doctors would be watching too, to make people aware of how many there are. Even when people know about it, there's like, oh, how many is there? Is there 1,000 of you in the United States? I mean, they don't know anything about it anyway. I don't know how we can tackle that or how they can do that in other countries. But, that I think would be a good step to try to pursue that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, we're not, I mean, as Barb said, we're not a huge organization. We only have a full-time staff of 2. And then we have a pretty active board who contributes a lot of time and expertise and talent. But yeah, throughout our history, if you're looking at our database, we've probably had contact with about, maybe around 50,000 polio survivors, and there's still, like you said, between 300 and 400,000 in the US. So there's still, a significant population that we haven't been able to reach or haven't had contact with. But opportunities like the recent case in New York, as unfortunate as it is, it does give us maybe the opportunity to get our information out there and educate some people about polio and about the late effects of polio. So we try to use these short, small windows of opportunity we have where there's an interest in polio issues to try to educate people who are unaware of post-polio syndrome.
Thank you, Brian. And actually, that's one of the goals of this organization. Once again, as I said in the onset, we're not going to be a support group. We're going to be an awareness group, and awareness comes into marketing. And we're going to work as a marketing kind of a group to bring awareness to the whole situation. Constance, you have a hand up?
Yes, thank you, Ken. I appreciate the opportunity. There so much has been going on in my head as I've been listening, and I absolutely want to join everyone in thanking Brian for sharing all of the marvelous things that PHI has been doing over the years. I have been a devotee practically for all my adult life in terms of understanding you are a primary resource for not only expertise for our doctors, but also support in giving the patients information. So thank you, and thank PHI and all of those volunteers and your other staff, paid staff people. Spot on, absolutely spot on. Couple of points just that I'd like to put out there for this group, and Ken, for you perhaps as our kind of leader and coordinator on this situation. Number one, the topic of helping medical schools understand what's going on. I am so empathetic with that because I have seen that as well. I'm in here in Las Vegas. Don't be fooled by the background. I needed something cool and green because we're at 115 degrees right now. So I wanted something cool. But the key behind this has been what I have personally, as a post-polio survivor, I really want to make sure my doctor is knowledgeable and understanding. When I establish a connection with my doctors, I find that they can talk to each other, and the doctor will listen to the doctor better than the doctor will listen to the patient. So my doctor, my pain management doctor, not my orthopedist, not my neurologist, not my PCP, my pain management doctor, younger man, open to listening to old ladies who, seem to know what they're talking about, also mentors and teaches at one of the local medical schools in town. He brings his little trainee interns in every time he meets with me once a month. We have our meeting. He nods at me, waves, and walks out the door and leaves me with the two of them or three of them, however many they are. And for the next half hour, we do a mini lesson on and a debriefing about what the hell is polio and what do we do about it now. I do that every month with him. Yeah, it's only maybe 2 or 3 faces at a time, but I'll tell you what, I've already had 2 of them say, we're going back to our college and we are going to ask our dean to have you come and be a speaker because this is something all of us need to hear about. So it is word of mouth and trickle effect. Patients, we need to be the ones to be comfortable advocating for ourselves and to be the squeaky wheel, as it were, number one. Number two, as far as the translation of resources, that's a universal problem, and I totally, Brian, love the fact that y'all have done as much as you have done. I think, Ken, maybe it's me, but I think Rotary, with its international connection, could perhaps provide some support in terms of marketing and putting the word out of other countries participating in helping with translation. And again, I go back to, forgive me, I'm a lifelong 45-year veteran retired educator. I go back to education because that's how we all learn things. So why can't we, or Rotary, or us as polio survivor patients, be able to talk to the local universities and colleges and ask them to help Brian and PHI do translations through their foreign language departments in the local schools and colleges? They can perhaps help you, Brian, in terms of having more international access to your literature and give resources in that manner to people who might otherwise not be able to have resource, because now you can say you'd have the translations in 100 different languages instead of maybe a handful. Just a thought.
Yep.
Now, as far
that's a great point. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a third piece in terms of how do we get the word out, because we are a very small general overall population. One of the things that I've been working with a couple of other groups, and I'll tell you what the outcome has been interesting, is that we as the members here, and Ken, with your far-reaching Rotary access, can help with that as well. We as the survivors have a story to tell. When we tell the story in a group like this, we're preaching to the choir. What we need to do, and I will be more than happy to cooperate with anybody who feels the same way about this, and we can get this started, we need to develop a compilation book, an anthology, if you will. 20 polio survivors from the United States, 25 polio survivors from Canada, 15 polio survivors from Australia. I don't care what country, there are polio survivors all over the world. We can compile multiple books and put them even in multiple languages that tell our stories, not only from childhood when we contracted the disease, but now as seniors who are dealing with the late effects of the disease, and how we have overcome, compensated, modified, and adapted to give the message to other folks, hey, this is still out there, it's still happening, it's still something that needs attention. I've worked with several people regarding compilation books on other subjects. I would love to see compilation books in multiple languages with a worldwide focus that gives visibility to polio survivors, and most importantly at this point for us personally, post-polio. Okay, and yes, it has been done in isolation, but I think with Rotary support, Ken, we can look at this as a more global thing and not just something that happens in one country or in one city. We are an international condition that requires international connection and visibility. And the last piece of visibility that I wanted to bring up to you is there are a bazillion now, unlike when we were youngsters, there are a bazillion local television networks. Roku is a prime example of ways to access some of those things. Okay, there's a local TV channel I've been a guest speaker on about 3 times now already, and the producer wants me to come back and talk about polio, the late effects of polio, and what are we doing. So there are vehicles and forums for us, both as individuals and as an organization, Ken, whispering in your ear about Rotary again, where we can use the local TV channels as mediums to continue to get the message out and expand the message. And who knows, maybe one of these days, you know, Kelly Clarkson's sitting there watching her local, you know, Roku channel, and she sees one of us talking about post-polio and says, hey, I want those people on my channel. Just
Great.
thought I'd toss those ideas out. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Constance.
Thank you.
And there's many good reasons to have a Rotary as the base of what we're doing. So, Kimberly, it's good to see you. You have a question? Did I lose you somewhere?
Hi, good
I
to
think
see
she's
you,
on
Ken.
mute, yeah.
Okay.
Ken, thank you for
Yeah.
having me today, and Brian. My name is Kim Smith. I'm the polio coordinator with March of Dimes Canada in Canada. So yeah, I've been in this role since February, and I just wanted to update that here at March of Dimes Canada, we do have a medical list of professionals that treat polio clients. But that list is from 2018. It's now 2022. So my challenge is to update that list. So I'm going to be doing that hopefully, you know, by December. And it's one of the gaps in services I find with people with polio is they're looking for professionals that will help them treat their post-polio symptoms, and they have a difficult time finding that professional. So we are working here in Canada on getting that list at March of Dimes Canada that's updated, and the goal is to have it be more comprehensive. Right now, it's few and far between. It's only 2 pages. As you can imagine, there's a lot more people that treat post-polio, but it's a matter of finding them. We also have a post-polio package. I know you guys had mentioned, you know, it would be nice to have such a package. We do have a post-polio package here at March of Dimes Canada. Again, that package is from 2018. So some of the contacts and things like that have changed. So that's another part of my goal, is to get that updated, likely by December of this year, to get that post-polio package updated as well. We also want to do an audit of polio clients, survivors across Canada. We have numbers that are thrown out there. The numbers are 20 to 30,000 survivors in Canada. We don't know exactly where those numbers are coming from. We would like to get a count of how many polio survivors there are still alive in Canada. So that is another goal of mine, maybe by December, but I think that is a little bit ambitious. I think really into 2023, we're looking at ways of getting that count. Another thing that we want to do is, there's so many support groups across Canada, and we want to get an audit of other groups. We want to do an environmental scan and find out exactly who are the experts in helping people with polio across Canada. So let's find out all the groups that are there. Let's get the key contacts. I know Mona is here today, Polio Quebec. She would be a key contact, for example. We want to have that list available to us in Canada. But I just wanted to pipe in and say, hi, Brian. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. And it was great to get to know you today, and a little bit more about what you guys do at your organization. And as always, Ken, thank you so much for the work that you do. It's so great to be invited to these meetings, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Kimberly. Yeah, March of Dimes Canada is a great organization, and they have a lot of great post-polio information as well. Elizabeth Lounsbury who's with her. She was a longtime PHI board member, so we have pretty close connections. And I've actually been up there and visited March of Dimes Canada and seen their facilities. And like I said, they do a great job. So if you're in Canada, need information, definitely reach out to them.
Thank you. Kim, I'm working on a calendar because one of the things as advocates is we need to keep ourselves informed on what's going on. Are your meetings open for public, or are they closed meeting? Is it a closed meeting that you have every Wednesday?
It's really open to, it's tricky. I mean, we are a Canada nonprofit organization, right? So our funders, we are a funded organization, and they expect to be funding Canadian clients, Canadian programs, right? So we have grandfathered in a few people from other areas, but we do have some clients, very valuable clients from outside of Canada, but they are grandfathered in, and we are not advertising it to open it up to worldwide.
Okay.
We are actually opening it up to the Canadian clients. And the reason for that is quite simply that it could affect our, we are funded by funders, and it's a Canadian organization. So that's why we target our clients to the post-polio group. We have a post-polio group every Wednesday, support group, that meets online virtually, and it is targeted to Canadian clients.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Nilesh?
Good evening, everybody. I was thinking on a completely different angle. I mean, based on what Barbara said earlier, there are a lot of organizations for multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy and all that. So actually, I was looking at post-polio syndrome. Actually, it is very similar to aging and disability for other disabilities also, like fatigue, atrophy, lack of vitamin D, depression, incontinence. So there are a lot of doctors already trained to do such work. So we need to kind of, wherever there are no special organizations for people with polio in some countries. I think this is a very similar situation in India. We could tap these organizations and address a larger picture as aging and disability. I think, lot more could be achieved in this way, because there are a lot of similarities than differences that are there. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Nilesh. We can explore that. We can explore that. We'll talk offline about that, about your ideas. Sandra, you have your hand up?
Yes. Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. The lady that asked about compiling our stories. I don't remember her name. Is it Constance?
Constance, yep. Yes.
Okay. I am from Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. I'm the post-polio chairperson here. And we are compiling our polio stories with the intention of sharing our polio stories and about post-polio syndrome. We have retired physiatrist who contributed to our book, and the title is Polio Second Challenge. We had, sorry, I'm shaking because this is difficult, but I'm still trying to tell you.
You're doing fine. You're doing fine, Sandra.
Over the course of 2 meetings in 2012, I think, we had prepared for Dr. Hargadon, who is the physiatrist who has retired. I think we had about 50 plus questions for him that we presented to him, and he answered every one of them. And the Q&As are part of our book. We've been working at this since 2014. And fatigue issues and the ability to get the thoughts out of my head onto paper has been a challenge for me, but we are committed to getting it done. And so I just wanted to throw that out to you. And as to Brian, you were asking about Elizabeth Lounsbury.
Yes.
She's not with the board anymore. And
Oh, sure.
but I will tell her that you ask about her. And she was our voice on the Canadian March of Dimes board. And she is missed terribly because she did a lot for and on behalf of March of Dimes internationally. So thank you. And I hope this gives you some information. And when we get the book together and published, I would love for it to be handed out to anyone who wants it, because the information that survivors share is so powerful. And if we don't tell the young people today about polio and polio comes back, they're going to ask us, why didn't you tell me? So I feel very strongly about our polio story. So thank you for the opportunity to make my comments today.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you,
Sandra.
Sandra.
Yeah, thank you. And there's a question on the chat. Is that book going to be available online?
We got to get it published first.
Okay. One step at a time.
It's not done. I'm going to approach the Rotary clubs here. We have 1, 2, 3 here in Thunder Bay, and one in Nipigon, which is about half hour, 3/4 away. So I'm going to approach them for help financially.
Great. And if you need any support on that, let me know, Sandra.
Okay.
And
I appreciate that.
Yeah, please do. I mean, being in Rotary may help.
Yeah.
And Francis, you have a hand up.
Hi, I had a couple of points, somewhat different.
I'm shaking again.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
I'm a trustee with the British Polio Fellowship, and we've done documents for polio survivors and for clinicians. But I think, as somebody said, doctors listen to doctors, but they also listen to funders. And I think our current evolution of, we've had handbooks, we've had guidelines. The current jargon is pathway, so we're doing a pathway around with the help of George Allen here as well. Thank you, George. And John McFarlane done a huge amount in Europe, but I think this time we need to really focus on working within the system. So we're really trying to target the people who fund the the National Health Service in the UK, so the people who make the commissioning decisions. But one problem then that always comes up, which brings me to my second point, is numbers. I think numbers have been mentioned. Our numbers are as large as many of the other neurological diseases, but we're seen as a small community because the people here are all on board. But for example, we reckon there's something still in the UK between 60 and 100,000 people who've had polio in the past. But as our signed up membership, we only have 2,000. So in some ways our community, if you like, have allowed ourselves to become invisible in a way. And I think that's also happened because of our story. So if we're to compare ourselves to, say, MS or MND, somebody today contracting MS expects help, expects the doctors to understand, and goes and demands it. Our story, our acute phase was so many years ago, and the method of being treated was so different. We were, I'm sure like me, you were moved out of the system at 18 once you were an adult and fully grown. And there was absolutely nothing after that apart from this use it to lose it, to be independent, no one's going to help you, you've got to be better than everybody else. And we did that for years and we got used to it. And we're not used to asking for help. So I think we are preaching here to the converted in a way. Everybody here, I imagine, has become really convinced about PPS and how devastating it can be to still be getting worse as you go through life. We also need to reach the polio survivors themselves, and we need to put some real meat behind the numbers and the people who are invisible, and this is very, very hard to do. So I'm sure you all know about this, but basically anytime we approach a health minister or a politician or a clinician, they say, well, how many of you are there? And you come out with big numbers, but they don't see them. You know, they maybe see one very large GP clinic with maybe 20,000 members might know that they have 1 or 2 people. They may actually have 10 or 20 or 50, but those people have never gone to them about polio. So we ourselves need to reach out to the other members of the polio community who are not signed up to advocating and going and asking for help. So, okay.
Thank you, Francis. And yes, the many people in here are in the choir. There's no question about that, and that's good. Up to this point, there have been support groups which have been tremendous in helping people get through all the challenges they're meeting. God bless them for doing that. But we're taking a different approach. We are the advocates, and the choir is the advocates, and everybody in this room has the opportunity to become an advocate if they're not already. Some of them already are. And it's important to start thinking about, I am an advocate, I can make a change, I can make a difference. And that's what we're here for, to do that. And we're asking everybody who's a part of this organization, this group, to become advocates. And as time goes on, we're going to talk about advocacy and how to do that. Yes, we are the choir, but we are the team. Each one of us now is on a team of advocates that are going to work on this. I see a lot of hands going up here. I know time's getting short. At this point, I wanted to end by the end of the half hour here. But John, you have a comment. John, you're on mute.
Sorry, Ken and everybody. I addressed a Rotary conference for the whole of Ireland, a little while ago. And there were about 450 delegates there. Out of that 450, I was approached by 46 people, all Rotarians, who all said that they had polio in their families. That is the way that you've got 1.4 million members. Now, if you can actually pick up who those people are through the Rotary membership, you're going to go a long way to actually getting the people, as I don't like to use the words, Francis, but get them out the woodwork. You can go from there, as if it can go across, which I know there's another discussion about. If it can go across the Rotary membership, what can happen is that you will find that the Rotary people will land up. I had lots of people turning around and saying they didn't know that their siblings had polio. They didn't know that that they had other people had polio, other relations, cousins, and everything else. And 46 out of 450, 10%. You start pulling that number. You start pulling that number together, and you start going with 1.4 million. Yeah. And I bet you'll find a lot more people.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, John. You hit the right on that. Marietta?
I was just wondering, there used to be a post-polio clinic in Toronto at the West Park Hospital, and they closed it. And I'm just wondering how do I advocate to get that clinic open again? It was really good for us because they had specialists that understood what we were going through, OTs, respirologists. You know, Dr. Goldstein was fully savvy about our conditions and so forth. But anyway, they closed. Do you or does anybody have any idea how I would advocate to get them going again?
I would love to talk with you offline on that and see the details of it and see what we can do. You have my contact information, or if you're not, it's my name, kennethmasson@gmail.com. There's a strategy we'd have to work on to do that and find out details of the whole thing. Is anybody familiar with what she's talking about?
I had heard a little bit about it. Kimberly from March of Dimes Canada might know more, might have some specific information about that. She might be a good person to connect with.
Yeah, we could look into it for sure. This is the first that I've been brought up to speed on this, so I'd have to look into it, find out where, what was existing. So this is new information for me. So for sure, I don't have anything to add right now, but I'll look into it. I will, Marietta, and stay in touch with you.
Yeah, if you can, you have shared contact information, hopefully, so you can talk about it further.
Yeah, we do. I did write down the name of the clinic that you were talking about in Toronto. So I'll do some research and get back to you.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
And maybe you can keep us informed on how that's going. Dick, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to make an unpaid, unrequested solicitation for all of us to make donations to our local support groups. I'm sure I can't do this correctly, but anyway, I got my bill from Brian, and I'm going to send him a check. Okay. And I would encourage all of us to do the same, as well as our local support groups, because they have expenses for their websites and whatever. So a $20 check or whatever you can send is certainly supported.
Yay. Good advertisement. Great. I love it. Sandra, you have your hand up?
Yes, the Marietta, the Toronto the Post-Polio clinic it's closed. I think it closed a few years ago, and I'm not sure of if it will be reopened or not, but I know that it has closed.
Yeah, I think what we need to do is get some of the details, and I think Kimberly will work on that. Yeah, so find out what's going on there.
Yeah, so I thought I'd just say that.
Thank you, Sandra. Maureen?
Yes, good morning all, and thank you for this wonderful meeting today. I had a call yesterday from a polio survivor. We both live in Florida, and we used to have a wonderful post-polio clinic down at the University of Miami in Miami. And of course, it was run initially and started by Dr. Vandernacker. So, she's now out in California. So it's California's gain to our loss, unfortunately. And like everybody else, I mean, we just don't have as in the words of Barbara Gratzky, a multidisciplinary clinic where you can see a doctor, you can see a brace man, you can see a therapist, et cetera, et cetera. And she's wanting to start one, but she just doesn't know how to do it. And And when she talked to Dr. Sherman, I know, Barbara, you know him, Sherman, and he just like puts up his hands. And, you know, I mean, I know we're not, we don't have a lot, you know, these practices don't have a lot of polio patients in their practice. And it's like, you know, they don't need to know anything because we're an aging group and we'll be gone soon. And it, you know, it's unfair. You know, I mean, if we had other conditions, they would certainly, everybody would be right on the ball. But because it's polio, I mean, how do we get the doctors, I guess it's especially physiatrists, on board to learn? You know, is there some kind of an incentive that these physicians need to get with the program? I mean, how many are we? 300,000 left? I don't know, whatever that number is, but that certainly is enough for them to learn something. You know, they can take care of you, you know, that's a little bit more in their pocket, I suppose. But I don't know, what do we do? How are we going to take care of, you know, our people? Our March of Dimes, you know, they took off on us, and now they're into saving babies, and, you know, which is fine, but, you know, they're also using March of Dimes money that I believe most of our parents went out door to door. And it's.
And it would be good sometime, Maureen, to get some doctors in here to talk and find out. Once again, I'd like to get to the essence of why. I've heard many reasons, but I'd like to get to the essence of why they're not paying more attention to the polio situation. So, Deborah, you have your hand up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Got to get her off mute. Deborah, you there? Okay, I'm going to turn to Barbara at this point with her hand up, and I know Brian's got places to go, so we need to probably end this soon. But,
yeah, I'll just be brief. You know, so many people have so many important things to say, but I have done a lot of disability advocacy, you know, throughout the last 25 years with the Centers for Independent Living. And I want to know more about the Rotary Disability Advocacy Group too. But as Maureen and I, we both live in South Florida, but back in 2004, there was a famous Alzheimer's doctor at the University of Miami, and he was a polio survivor. And a lot of times I go look up to see what people are polio survivors. If you look up their backgrounds, a lot of times you can key in on that word. But I went with him, and he helped me set up through the Department of Neurology and the Department of Rehab Medicine, he helped me set up post-polio clinic at the University of Miami that went strong until he moved to Arizona to do the Muhammad Ali Alzheimer's Center. And so many times I've got, you know, everything's all set up, but then something happens and you lose your contact that's a decision maker. You have to get to people that are the decision makers. But I certainly, you know, we need to find the doctors, and I'm not sure, you know, the younger doctors don't have relatives maybe with polio, so it gets harder and harder.
Yeah, well,
but I'm willing to try again. You just get burnt out.
yeah, of course, but we're gonna reignite you, Barbara. That's what.
Well, I appreciate this group, because maybe
okay.
this is what we need, because with Rotary backing us up, that's going to be, you know, awesome. Thank you.
Right. Well, we'll work on that, Barbara. Deborah.
Okay, now I'm back in shape here.
Okay.
I wanted to just say that, you know, I think as a Rotarian and as a polio survivor, our important job is to get the word out there, to vaccinate. That's what we're working on in our post-polio network right now. Carol and I just did we just went over to Amish country and tried to plant seeds for those folks to get immunized. My Rotary group is doing a packing of in August of information for children. We're going to be delivering them to, oh my goodness, I can't think this morning, to daycares and preschools, and for information for the children. Carol has been working on that over in Bucks County. They're rocking and rolling over there. But I think that as Rotarians and as polio survivors, the best thing we can do is get out there and be advocates of this disease, and just spread the word of the importance, and let people see what use ourselves as examples.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. I mean, and you make a good point. We've got to think of areas too that are not educated on this. And you're talking about the Amish country, and they probably are not. So thank you for doing that. So I thank everybody for coming. Once again, we'd like you to think about being an advocate and what you can do to be an advocate. We'll take steps on that in the future to talk about more about advocacy. The group I belong to, the Rotary Disability Advisors Group, and we're working on advocacy training on that. So we need to focus on advocacy just for post-polio syndrome. I thank Brian so much for coming here. I appreciate so much what your organization does and has been done over these years. There's lots of people I hear from that said you were instrumental in their lives. So I thank you. You have any final words, Brian?
No, just again, thank you for having me here and explaining a little bit more about what we do. Appreciate the opportunity.
Great. When we see Brian and I have been talking, and a number of other people, we want to get Brian has not been necessarily into the Rotary network, so we're going to work on that. We think that's important to get him involved in that. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. We'll have another meeting in 2 weeks, which is what is this? The first today's Thursday, the first Thursday of the month. So we'll have a meeting then. I'm not sure what that date is. I don't have that right in front of me, but that's our next scheduled meeting. And I'll send out notices on that. And I appreciate all the comments and everybody coming here. And thank you for all we're gonna all stamp you, and not stamp you, that's a good point. Put a medal on you as being an advocate. As a being an advocate. So
can I ask Deborah if she has what she's sending out to the Amish, if she can somehow get that out to you to send to all of us? Because I just was asked this morning for something to hand out at a ball game that one of the districts is doing, and they wanted some information to be able to hand out to families. And so that might be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
Can you put your information in the chat or somehow that I could get it?
I did already.
Harry, Deb, I sent it to her from you.
Okay.
Oh, you did? Okay,
Betcha.
Carol's got my back. Okay.
That's quite a story, Chris.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Appreciate it, and have a good rest of your day. And we'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks.